Well, major Hurricane Erin is expected to stay offshore of the U.S. We're still going to be feeling some impacts here. To learn more with us, how it's going to be impacting the Carolinas, we got Eric Hayden on the line here, the warning coordination meteorologist at the National Weather Service office in Morehead City. Eric, talk about how Erin's going to be impacting the Carolina coast here.
Erin's really a good example of impacts occur well away from the center of the storm. You mentioned an offshore track that really hasn't changed. We don't expect that to change. But we have to keep in mind tropical storm force winds extend more than 200 miles from the center. So we will see impacts in North Carolina, specifically along the immediate coastline and especially the Outer Banks, where we'll see some beach erosion, ocean overwash, and portions of Highway 12 probably impassable for at least a couple days.
And you mentioned that, 15 to 20 foot waves. Talk about how often you guys are using, terminology similar to that. That feels like it's awfully tall for some of those waves.
It is. We get a lot of storms on the Outer Banks, not just hurricanes, but also nor'easters. We get coastal flooding, but there's going to be a lot of power and energy with those waves. 15 to 20 foot plus grabs your attention for sure. But there's something called the period, the length between those waves. It's more than 15 or 16 seconds. That's a lot of power in those waves, a lot of water coming up onto the coast. And before it can go back into the ocean, another wave is already rolling in. So this is unlike anything we've seen recently. A lot of people, again, are used to hurricanes. They're used to nor'easters on the Outer Banks, but really trying to get that message out. Just because it's a couple hundred miles off the coast, a hurricane is not a dot on a map. Impacts extend hundreds of miles from the center, and we'll certainly see that here later this week.
And you've got some mandatory evacuations in place for some of the Outer Banks because of that flooding. How does that compare to say, storm surge flooding with tropical systems?
So we do expect a rise of water ahead of this storm because Erin's so large and powerful, it continues to grow in size. So we'll see those swells start to reach our beaches as early as later tonight into the day Tuesday. But we really expect the peak with Erin in terms of coastal flooding, beach erosion, that ocean overwash Wednesday into Thursday. So it is directly related to Erin. The other thing we're factoring in, a slightly higher than normal tide cycle will coincide with this the middle part of the week. So you combine that with some of the poor dune structures along the Outer Banks and especially concerned with Highway 12. And that's why they did those mandatory evacuations for places like Hatteras Island and also Ocracoke Island.
And, rip currents, of course, going to be a huge possibility. You touched on that. How long is that threat going to be around for? It's probably going to be worse around the middle of this week, but how long is that going to linger into maybe this weekend upcoming?
We really appreciate you mentioning that. In 2019, we, of course, had Dorian, but we lost more lives with Lorenzo, which was more than 1,500 miles from the coast. We lost 8 people on our East Coast beaches. We are already seeing those swells arriving today, so a high threat for rip current starts now, and that will last right into at least the end of the week. So even as Erin starts to pull away, it takes a while for those seas to calm down. So folks should definitely not be in the water. Keep in mind, even if it's sunny out like a day like today, those swells are already starting to reach the beach later today, and they'll be here for the remainder of the week.
And Eric, what else should folks know about this storm? Maybe something that they're not thinking about. We're trying to touch on things, like rip currents that are, pretty easily forgotten when you start talking about tropical systems.
Rip currents is one, and then the other is even with an offshore track, we're going to see that hazardous conditions on the roadway. So coastal flooding, beach erosion, that Highway 12, may be impassable for multiple days this upcoming week. So again, a classic example. The storm itself, the center may remain a couple hundred miles off the coast, but we stress it all the time. That forecast cone just shows where the center of the storm is expected to go. It does not show all the impacts, and those impacts certainly occur well outside of the cone itself. So just a reminder for folks, don't let their guard down just because we're not expecting a landfall at this time. Still expecting some pretty big concerns, especially along Outer Banks and the immediate North Carolina coastline.
And you mentioned your concerns about Highway 12. Why are the concerns so much higher for that highway in particular as we get into the Outer Banks? You want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, it's a beautiful area. If you've ever been on Highway 12, there's spots where we just don't have a lot of dunes. So as you head south, places like Pea Island, Buxton, the north end of Ocracoke, one of the most beautiful stretches of coastline in the entire country. I'm biased. I think Eastern North Carolina beaches are the best, but we're vulnerable because some spots have already been washed away from previous storms. We don't have a lot of dunes to protect us. And that highway is only a few feet above sea level in spots. So we're used to the flooding. We get this even with winter storms such as nor'easters, but we are especially concerned with Erin, such a large storm, so much energy with those waves. And we're not just talking 1 day or 2 days, it's over multiple days. So that could wash away some of the dunes we currently have, and that will leave them even more vulnerable later in the week.
Do you know what it would take to kind of rebuild those dunes and how long that process takes when we have, just about it feels like a storm every year that works away at that erosion there?
It can take a while. There's certainly nourishment projects they do along the Outer Banks and trying to rebuild those dunes. But the power of water is incredible. We talk about that turn around, don't drown, always telling people not to cross flooded roads. It's equally as powerful when you're taking away structures like the dunes. It's amazing. You see those large waves, so much energy with them. They can really create a lot of destruction right along the immediate coastline.
Eric Hayden, warning coordination meteorologist at the National Weather Service office in Morehead City. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.